I don't care what anybody else thinks because what's for me is already written. So whatever you think, whatever you want to say, it didn't matter.
It's us. It's the high stakes of building a business, a legacy business together. It's raising 3 girls, keeping love alive.
From the outside, HGTV's Egypt Sherrod and Mike Jackson seemed to have it all: successful careers, a beautiful family, and undeniable chemistry on and off screen. But behind the smiles and renovations was a love story shaped by obstacles, unconventional choices, and one unforgettable twist. What kept them together when so much could have pulled them apart? Before their names became synonymous with stylish renovations and HGTV success, Egypt Sherrod and Mike Jackson were 2 ambitious souls carving out separate paths in 2 of the toughest industries imaginable. Their worlds were, on the surface, miles apart, one dominated by radio airwaves, the other by late-night turntables. Yet both were fueled by rhythm, hustle, and an unwavering determination to rise above the crowd. Egypt's story began in the buzzing heart of New York City radio. She had a natural gift for conversation, a quick wit that could hold an audience, and an energy that felt larger than the studio itself. The microphone was her stage, and her voice carried her into the homes, cars, and daily routines of thousands. But radio was never just a job. It was her way of connecting, of weaving herself into the heartbeat of the city. Behind the glamour of being a recognizable voice, Egypt's climb was anything but easy. She learned early that media was a business of constant reinvention. Staying relevant required late nights, early mornings, and a thick skin for criticism. Yet even in the whirlwind of deadlines and on-air responsibilities, she held on to her dream of building something lasting, not just a career, but a life filled with meaning. Meanwhile, in a completely different corner of the entertainment world, Mike Jackson was chasing his own version of success. A rising star on the nightclub scene, Mike wasn't just a DJ, he was a curator of moments. He knew how to read a crowd, how to keep a dance floor alive until sunrise, and how to make each set feel like an event people would talk about long after the music faded. But beneath the surface of flashing lights and pounding bass, Mike's journey was just as grueling. The nightlife industry demanded stamina and an almost relentless social presence. His calendar was packed with gigs, networking events, and appearances, each one an opportunity to cement his reputation. To outsiders, it looked like an endless party, but to Mike, it was a calculated hustle with a clear goal: to turn his passion for music into a long-term career. In those early years, Egypt and Mike's circles brushed against each other more than once. They moved through the same city, breathed the same electric nightlife air, and occasionally crossed paths at events. But the timing was never quite right. At this stage, they were both too focused on their individual trajectories to imagine how closely those paths would one day intertwine. If you had told Egypt back then that the DJ working the club circuit would one day be her partner in both life and business, she might have laughed. If you had told Mike that the confident radio personality he admired from afar would one day be the woman he built a family with, he might have doubted it too. What neither of them could see at the time was that the skills they were sharpening, her ability to engage and connect, his instinct for creating energy and momentum, would one day merge into a powerhouse partnership. But fate, as it often does, had a way of biding its time. Looking back, those before the spotlight years were essential. They shaped who Egypt and Mike would become, not just as individuals, but as a couple capable of weathering both the highs of public success and the lows that inevitably follow. Their independent grinds taught them resilience, their separate passions taught them balance, and though they didn't know it yet, every step they took was leading them toward the moment their stories would collide. Neither of them knew that fate would keep throwing them together until it became impossible to ignore. Missed connections. Some love stories begin with an instant spark, a single meeting that changes everything. For Egypt, Sherrod, and Mike Jackson, it began with something far less cinematic, an encounter that came and went so quickly it could have been forgotten. It was years before their names would be paired together in HGTV credits, years before social media would follow their every move. Egypt was already a familiar voice on the airwaves, commanding the kind of presence that made listeners feel like they knew her personally. Mike was building his reputation in the nightlife scene, his sets drawing crowds in a city where competition was relentless. Their first meeting was at a nightclub event. Egypt was backstage, working the kind of gig that was second nature to her. Mike, Working the DJ booth was just another professional on the lineup to her, except he wasn't. From the moment he saw her, Mike was struck. She had that rare combination of confidence and ease, the kind that can't be faked. But to Egypt, Mike's world carried a reputation she had learned to be cautious about. DJs, in her experience, were charming, surrounded by admirers, and often living in a rhythm that didn't align with hers. She sized him up quickly, filing him away in her mind as someone she'd be polite to, but not pursue. The night ended without fanfare, no exchanged numbers, no promises to see each other again. Just a passing moment, one that, under normal circumstances, might have been the last. Months later, fate decided to test them again. This time, it was at the Puerto Rican Day Parade, one of the city's biggest cultural celebrations. The streets were alive with music, flags, and a crowd that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. Mike spotted her in the chaos, her energy matching the electric atmosphere around them. It should have been the perfect setting for something to happen, a phone number, a shared laugh, maybe even a date. Instead, it was another moment that passed too quickly. Whether it was bad timing, crowded streets, or simply that neither was ready to see the potential, they parted ways again. If this were a movie, these near misses might have been played for comedy. In reality, they were just blips in two busy lives. At the time, neither Egypt nor Mike had any reason to believe the universe was nudging them toward something bigger. Looking back, though, it's hard not to see the pattern. Two people in the same city, moving through overlapping circles, crossing paths just enough for recognition, but not enough for connection. Each encounter was like a note in a song they didn't yet realize they were both writing. Years later, Mike would admit that those early encounters stuck with him. Even without deep conversation, there was something about Egypt that made an impression. He didn't know her story, but he sensed there was more to her than the polished professionalism she showed in public. For Egypt, those missed connections were barely more than background noise in a life filled with deadlines and events. But she would remember his face when she saw it again. Only this time, the setting would be different. And in that new setting, the casual acquaintance she had once brushed off would have the chance to prove he was more than just another familiar face in a crowded industry. But destiny was persistent, and it had one more unexpected setup in store. From dance floors to rooftops. By the time Egypt Sherrod saw Mike Jackson again, it had been long enough for those earlier encounters to fade into the blur of industry faces. But this time, the circumstances were different, very different. It wasn't a nightclub or a parade. It wasn't loud music and crowded streets. It was business. Egypt, already established in real estate, had a property renovation underway. The kind of project that starts with optimism and vision but quickly becomes a test of patience when things go wrong. And on this particular day, something had gone very wrong. The contractor she'd been working with had made a costly mistake, leaving her project stalled and her stress levels climbing. She needed someone she could trust to fix the mess, and fast. That's when a mutual acquaintance mentioned Mike Jackson. Egypt was skeptical at first. She knew him as a DJ, not as a contractor. But what she didn't realize was that Mike had built a second career for himself in construction and renovation, leveraging the same creativity and hustle that had driven his work in music. When Mike showed up at the property, Egypt recognized him immediately. That same tall frame, the same confident presence, the same spark in his eyes. But instead of turntables, he came armed with tools, blueprints, and a calm assurance that he could handle the situation. And he did. In fact, Mike didn't just fix the problem, he went above and beyond. He offered solutions Egypt hadn't considered, worked quickly, and treated her project as if it were his own. For someone used to doing everything herself, Egypt found his reliability disarming. Over the next few weeks, their professional collaboration became something more. They found themselves lingering after meetings, swapping stories about their respective industries, laughing over shared frustrations, and discovering they had more in common than either expected. It wasn't the whirlwind romance of a dance floor or the happenstance of a crowded parade. It was something steadier, something built in real time. They were learning how the other handled challenges, how they thought under pressure, and how they treated people when things didn't go according to plan. For Mike, this was his chance to change Egypt's first impression of him. Gone was the image of the charismatic DJ living for the next party. In its place was a man with discipline, ambition, and the ability to keep his word. For Egypt, it was the beginning of a shift in how she saw him. The player-like vibe she'd once assumed gave way to a man with quiet depth, someone who didn't just want to impress her, he wanted to show her he could be counted on. One evening after wrapping up work for the day, Mike invited Egypt to a rooftop event he was helping organize. It was part networking, part celebration, with music, food, and a skyline view that stretched endlessly across the city. Standing there under the fading light, with the hum of conversation around them and the city twinkling below, Egypt felt something she hadn't before, a genuine pull toward him. It wasn't just an attraction. It was the realization that the man beside her might just be someone worth letting in. Mike, too, felt the shift. All the missed connections, all the years of crossing paths without ever really meeting, seemed to fall away. Here they were, not as strangers in passing, but as two people finally seeing each other clearly. Yet, the path to happily ever after would first have to pass through old wounds neither had fully healed. The ghosts of past relationships. By the time Egypt, Sherrod, and Mike Jackson began to acknowledge the growing spark between them, life had already made it clear that love rarely comes without baggage. Neither was walking into this new connection with a blank slate. Their pasts weren't neatly tucked away, they lingered, shaping decisions and emotions in ways both subtle and unavoidable. For Mike, that past took the form of a previous marriage. His relationship with his ex-wife had ended years earlier, but one permanent bond remained, their daughter. Co-parenting was not just a duty for him, it was a central part of his identity. He was deeply committed to being present in her life, making decisions with her well-being always in mind. At first, this was not a source of friction. In fact, Egypt admired it. She respected his devotion as a father and appreciated the way he prioritized his child above all else. But as their relationship deepened, the reality became more complex. Mike's past wasn't a closed chapter, it was an ongoing story, and Egypt was stepping into it midstream. There were phone calls from his ex-wife that couldn't be ignored, weekends carefully planned to ensure time with his daughter, and an unspoken awareness that every major decision from moving in together to the possibility of marriage would ripple through a larger family network. Even with goodwill on all sides, blending lives was not going to be seamless. For Egypt, the weight of the past was different, but no less real. She had long built her life and career on independence, and that independence had been partly forged through relationships that left her cautious. She had been hurt before, deeply enough that trust was something she no longer offered freely. While she enjoyed the growing connection with Mike, there was always a small voice in the back of her mind asking the question she couldn't silence. Would this love last, or would it end the way others had? She didn't let fear dictate her actions, but it lingered like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. When marriage entered the conversation, the weight of both their histories became harder to ignore. Mike was ready to take that step, but he was acutely aware of the impact on his daughter and the need to keep co-parenting relationships stable. Egypt, meanwhile, found herself grappling with the vulnerability of committing fully, knowing that it meant putting her heart entirely on the line. At one point, they even set a tentative wedding date, only to push it back when outside tensions began to creep in. There was no dramatic confrontation, no heated ultimatum. The delay was quieter, but it carried weight. It forced them both to pause and ask the uncomfortable questions. Were they truly ready? And if not, what was still standing in their way? Rather than letting those doubts fester, they chose to address them head-on. They turned to therapy, not as a last resort, but as a proactive step. They understood that unspoken worries can grow in silence, and they didn't want resentment or misunderstanding to take root. In those sessions, they unpacked their individual histories, explored their fears, and learned to navigate the complexities of a blended family together. Sometimes they left feeling lighter, armed with new tools to strengthen their bond. Other times, they walked away heavy with the realization that some issues wouldn't be solved overnight. But they kept showing up, for the process and for each other. Slowly, trust began to deepen. The ghosts of their pasts didn't disappear completely, but they no longer dictated the terms of their future. Looking back, both Egypt and Mike have said this period became a quiet turning point. It was the season that taught them love is not just about chemistry or shared dreams, it's about doing the work. It's about facing the hard truths, merging two fully formed lives, and finding a way to build something new without losing the essence of who you are. Even as they prepared for a future together, life would hand them a challenge that no amount of planning could prevent. A miracle against the odds. By the time Egypt Sherrod and Mike Jackson had settled into the rhythm of their life together, they felt ready for their next chapter. Their blended family was already full of love: Egypt's daughter from a previous relationship, Mike's daughter from his prior marriage, and the home they were building side by side. But both longed to add one more child, someone who would be a bridge connecting all the branches of their family tree. At first, the journey toward that dream was filled with optimism. They imagined baby names, pictured holiday mornings with all the children together, and felt confident that it was only a matter of time. But as months slipped into years, the optimism began to waver. Each cycle of hope followed by disappointment chipped away at their confidence. Egypt had been living with chronic pain for years before receiving a diagnosis: endometriosis. The condition not only caused severe, often debilitating discomfort, but also posed real challenges to fertility. Every doctor's appointment became a balancing act between cautious optimism and the creeping fear that biology might not be on their side. They tried to focus on the positives, but the truth became harder to ignore. The more time passed, the less likely their dream seemed. For Egypt, the strain wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. She watched Mike try to remain upbeat for her sake, but she could see the quiet disappointment in his eyes. Eventually, her health forced a difficult decision. The endometriosis pain was growing unbearable, impacting not only her quality of life but also her ability to be present for the family she already had. Her doctor recommended a partial hysterectomy, a surgery that would relieve her pain but end any chance of conceiving naturally. The choice was agonizing. Saying yes to the surgery meant closing a door they had been trying to walk through for years. But it also meant relief, freedom from the pain that had shadowed her days. In the end, she chose her health and her family's stability over a hope that seemed increasingly out of reach. The date for surgery was set, and then, just before the procedure, everything changed. As part of routine pre-surgical testing, Egypt's doctor ordered a standard check. The results came back with a single piece of news so unexpected that at first, it didn't feel real. She was pregnant. The moment was surreal. After years of effort, tears, and dashed hopes, here it was, the very thing they had wanted most, arriving at the precise moment they had stopped believing it would happen. Egypt would later call it divine timing, a miracle she could neither explain nor take for granted. The pregnancy, however, was not without its risks. Given her medical history, doctors classified it as high risk from the start. But Egypt approached it with the same grit that had carried her through every other challenge in life. Mike, too, stepped up in every way possible, taking on more household duties, keeping her spirits up and guarding her from unnecessary stress. In 2019, their daughter Harper was born. The moment Egypt held her in her arms for the first time, all the years of heartache melted away. The pain, the waiting, the uncertainty, it all seemed to have been leading to that one perfect moment. Harper's arrival didn't just complete their family, it deepened the bond between Egypt and Mike in ways they hadn't anticipated. They had been through uncertainty together, clung to each other through disappointments, and come out the other side stronger. The experience became a reminder that life's detours often lead to the most extraordinary destinations. But as magical as Harper's birth was, it didn't mean the road ahead would be free of challenges. Parenthood, especially within a blended family, brought new dynamics, fresh demands, and the risk of losing sight of the relationship itself. And as they would learn, even the happiest of miracles doesn't eliminate the need to keep nurturing the love that built the family in the first place. The joy of family expansion couldn't mask the reality that marriage itself still required work, and sometimes reinvention. The rules of lasting love. By the time Egypt Sherrod and Mike Jackson had navigated the joys and challenges of blending their family and welcoming their daughter Harper, they understood something that many couples take years to learn. Love alone is not enough to keep a marriage thriving. Love is the foundation, but it needs structure, intention, and, in their case, the courage to rewrite the traditional rules of marriage to suit who they truly were as individuals. For them, That meant crafting an arrangement that worked for their personalities, their schedules, and their emotional needs, regardless of whether outsiders understood it. One of their most unconventional choices, and the one that raised the most eyebrows, was maintaining separate bedrooms. For many couples, the idea might seem like a sign of trouble. For Egypt and Mike, it was the exact opposite. It wasn't about distance, resentment, or lack of intimacy. It was about preserving personal space and individuality within a shared life. Egypt, fiercely independent and accustomed to carving her own path, relished the comfort of having a room that was entirely hers. It was a space where she could unwind, think, and recharge without distraction. Mike, equally self-reliant, enjoyed having his own retreat to decompress after long days. Far from creating separation, this arrangement gave them something rare in marriage, a sense of choice when it came to togetherness. Time spent together became intentional, not habitual. But their rulebook didn't end there. They were also committed to keeping their relationship playful. Life had a way of pulling them in a dozen directions: raising children, managing busy careers, running businesses, appearing on television. It was easy to slip into the pattern of being co-managers of a household instead of partners in love. To guard against that, they made sure to inject fun into their daily lives. They scheduled date nights, even if it was just a quick dinner without the kids. They left small surprises for each other, sent lighthearted texts during the day, and made an effort to flirt just as they had in the early stages of their romance. Egypt often joked that in marriage, a little mystery was just as vital in year 10 as it was in year 1. Another cornerstone of their approach was radical honesty. With both of them working in the public eye, surrounded by colleagues, fans, and potential distractions, they knew that insecurities could creep in if left unaddressed. They committed to tackling difficult conversations head-on, whether the subject was money, parenting, or the occasional twinge of jealousy. Still, even with these guardrails in place, they weren't immune to strain. The relentless demands of career and family sometimes left them drained, with little energy left to invest in romance. At times, they slipped into a rhythm that felt more like running a joint business than sharing a marriage. It was in those moments that their unconventional rules became a lifeline. They reminded each other that protecting the relationship also meant protecting their individual well-being. Personal space wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. Fun wasn't frivolous, it was fuel. Honest conversations weren't confrontations, they were bridges. And yet they would later admit that no set of rules, no matter how thoughtfully designed, could shield them from every challenge. Marriage, especially one lived partly under the scrutiny of the public, had a way of exposing vulnerabilities they hadn't planned for. Little cracks began to appear, subtle signs of emotional distance that neither wanted to acknowledge at first. It was a sobering realization. While their rules kept them balanced, they couldn't replace the deeper, ongoing work of emotional connection. That work, they were about to discover, would be just as demanding and just as necessary as anything they had faced before. But even with their carefully crafted rules, cracks began to show, forcing them to face uncomfortable truths. The turning point. For years, Egypt Sherrod and Mike Jackson believed they had built a marriage strong enough to endure anything. They had blended their families, navigated the intense demands of public careers, welcomed a miracle child against the odds, and even established their own unconventional rules to protect their bond. From the outside, they seemed untouchable. But even the strongest relationships can drift quietly off course, and theirs was no exception. The shift wasn't sudden or dramatic, it crept in slowly, disguised as everyday life. The conversations that once came easily began to feel shorter, more transactional. The shared laughter that used to fill the quiet moments between them was replaced with silence, or, at best, polite exchanges about schedules and responsibilities. It wasn't that they had fallen out of love. The love was still there, buried beneath the layers of routine and obligation. The problem was that they had stopped actively nurturing it. Egypt would later confess that somewhere along the way, she had stopped prioritizing her own happiness. Her attention was consumed by the children, the household, the TV projects, and the endless to-do lists that came with their shared life. She thought she was doing the right thing, keeping everything running, making sure everyone else was cared for, but in the process, she had neglected her own needs. Mike, in his own way, had fallen into a similar trap. He threw himself into work and the responsibilities of family life, assuming that the foundation they had built in the early years would carry them through, but momentum, they would both learn, only lasts so long before it starts to fade. One evening, after another day spent moving around each other like co-workers in the same busy office, Egypt had a realization that chilled her. If they didn't take deliberate action soon, they could wake up one day as strangers sharing a house. There was no explosive argument, no breaking point, just the quiet dread of recognizing that connection was slipping away. They chose to act before it was too late. This wasn't their first time in therapy, but this time the focus was different. Instead of simply addressing external stressors, careers, parenting, schedules, they committed to rediscovering each other as people. The process was anything but easy. Therapy forced them to sit with discomfort. They had to listen without interrupting, absorb criticism without immediately defending themselves, and look beyond the words to understand the emotions underneath. Egypt spoke openly about feeling unseen, not just as a partner or a mother, but as a woman. Mike acknowledged that he sometimes withdrew, staying silent rather than risk an argument, not realizing that silence could be just as damaging. These weren't pleasant conversations, but they were necessary. The work wasn't about finding fault, it was about dismantling the invisible walls that had slowly risen between them and learning to reach for each other again. Over time, small but meaningful changes began to take root. They made deliberate eye contact, something they hadn't realized they'd stopped doing. They carved out time for conversations that had no agenda, talks about dreams, memories, or simply the little things that had made them laugh that day. They brought back the playful teasing that had once been second nature, turning inside jokes into a kind of private language that belonged only to them. Egypt began protecting time for her own joy, whether it was a solo outing, a creative project, or a quiet moment of self-care. Mike became more intentional in showing her that she mattered, not just through grand gestures, but in the small, consistent ways that build trust and intimacy. It wasn't a Hollywood-style turnaround. There was no single moment where everything magically clicked. It was a slow, deliberate rebuild, driven by a mutual decision. They didn't just want to stay married, they wanted to keep choosing each other every single day. In the end, their story is more than a tale of romance. It's proof that lasting love is built, tested, and rebuilt over time. Their marriage has survived challenges that could have broken it. But what other unseen struggles do seemingly perfect couples face? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section.